This is a work I did for one of my books on the topic of the connections that exist between muscles, kinetic chains, and also emotions. And this is a discipline that perfectly studies some branches of psychology, such as brain spotting and EMDR. These are disciplines that somehow indicate that when there is an emotional blockage, it will generate a disturbance, an anomaly in the microsaccade, and in that part of the muscle that should make a movement when the patient recalls that emotional trauma that occurred over time, a series of reverberations in the microsaccade or blockages in that movement occur in such a way that what that emotional blockage in the microsaccade will do is connect, it will send orders to the brain cortex, which we will see now. And it will also generate long-term alterations in the fascia that connects in such a way that a disturbance in a hyperreflexive moment of restlessness will generate a disturbance in the entire previous chain. In the lateral chains, in those related to processes that induce many processes of aggression, it will generate alterations in the posterolateral areas. In fears, it will generate alterations. That would be the elevation of the eye upwards. It will prevent that elevation of the eye. We will be able to explore it in a simple eye examination with a small magnifying glass, and we can see how suddenly the pupil flickers or generates a small movement in which it seems to have a kind of spring. That movement, that emotional feeling, will generate a disturbance that will affect the entire myofascial chain of the posterior and anterior chain in everything that is the back area. One of the proposals that exists to work on the myofascial chains is that if I, for example, want to activate the central nervous system and I am inducing an activation of the paravertebral chain, one of the things I need to carry out is an upward gaze. Why? So that the signaling and the command I will give to the brain is double the one produced by the chain, which is supported by the eye movement. To this, and we will also see in the training, we can add more posture, we can add tongue movements, we can add jaw movements, because each part of that process will reprogram the brain so that the body and health return to normal. Well, here we have some of the studies that have been done with imaging studies, in which, well, we see here a little small, we see how it connects the psychophysiological interaction between what is, for example, in this case, the right frontal eye field with the right supplementary eye field. Here you have the literature in case you want to make an image in moderately recent literature from the year 2019, which is already a bit anachronistic, but there are very interesting things. I am currently conducting research in which the field of reading is part of the therapeutic improvement of the microsaccade. Well, we have also talked about the eye, we have talked about the foot, we have talked about graviceptors, although there are no images. I promise that the training will teach you some information about the renal graviceptors, but also what impact the dentition has on posture. There is a connection not only between the foot and the eye, but also between the foot and the jaw, which, depending on the structure of the jaw and whether there is a disturbance in the foot receptors or not, can generate either an anterior pelvic tilt, a thrust of the entire trunk. It can generate hyperlordosis of the lumbar region, or simply, if the tooth is more or less correct, it can have a posture of total normality. How does this connect? This would connect with the temporomandibular joint, which will connect with the hyoid bone, generating a polyhedron called the polyhedron of interaction forces of lethal John, which will connect the hyoid bone with the thyroid, with T, with L, and with the pelvic floor. In such a way that at the moment any part of this triangle is altered, imagine a thyroiditis. A thyroid condition will generate a disturbance in the angle of this triangle, but it can also produce a disturbance in this angle, an intestinal inflammation process, or it will also produce an alteration in the part of L. That is to say, any part of the mechanics that is disturbed will generate an alteration in posture. Well, you have surely come here to know what our posture says, and indeed, we have a series of reprogramming that often come with us from birth, due to epigenetic aspects of our parents, of our grandparents, which carry out a series of alterations that are then found in the epigenome. Others that are related to a maturation process, how we mature from childhood, when we crawl and walk, generate a series of blockages, And there are also a series of traumas that occur throughout adult life that can also have the capacity to affect in such a way that we will find there would exist a series of psychobehavioral archetypes in movement that, well, in some way I have left here, but they are patterns that are not always pure. What does this mean? That I can have, for example, a trait of introversion, or I can have a blockage in which I am only protecting myself from the right side but not from the left. That is to say, I do not have to have genu valgum or genu varum in both legs, and perhaps it will only be found in the one that has a connection with that specific chain. What is happening here is that many times the cognitive processes in the brain will be found, they will be ahead of the rest of the person. Their brain is ahead of the body. In the impulsive, we will have the visceral person, that is to say, it retroacts the visceral part, the intestinal part, the enteric system, the pneumogastric system, projecting above what the central nervous system says. We have the receptive, the sattvic, the neutral, the one that has a correct alignment, both in the anterior and in the posterior. We also have the emotional, the affective, and the introverted. Well, how does this play out? We have talked then, because of course, if we have talked about the existence of three types of masses, apart from what I have said about inflammatory processes, indeed, an increase in pelvic mass due to digestive inflammations with intestinal absorption problems, where foods are generating a series of intolerances, food allergies, will affect the thoracic mass, the pelvic mass, which will also generate a series of increases in pressures. An increase in intra-abdominal pressure will generate an increase in intrathoracic pressure, which in the long term will generate an increase in ICP of intrathoracic pressure. Well, all of this will simultaneously generate, as I mentioned, reciprocal interactive bidirectional patterns going downwards towards the feet and vice versa, in such a way that it will generate small hypotonia, hypertonia, atonia of the muscles, which in turn will pivot on the thoracic hinges, generating the antepulsions I mentioned earlier. Of course, the topic, for example, of the core of the pelvic floor is very important. The work on the pelvic floor is usually well known. There is a lot of talk about the core, and even techniques like abdominal racing, abdominal Halloween, which are very interesting techniques to work on muscle hyperrigidity to ensure the stability of the lumbar region. You may say, how curious that I use the word hyperrigidity, which sounds very unflowing and terrible, but indeed what we seek is to produce extreme rigidity of the core musculature to work on stability. We work on these bands, on these diaphragms. We know the pelvic diaphragm, we work on the abdominal diaphragm, but little is known about the importance of the neck diaphragm, even the subarachnoid diaphragm, which we don't have time to develop, but is very important because it also relates to the stimulation of the central nervous system. Well, here we have examples of how these psychobehavioral postures, these aptitudes or rather attitudes, will generate different pathologies. A diaphragm that is unable to lower will ultimately generate a series of disturbances. Here we have the typology of the extroverted affective, which will allow the diaphragm to extend but will have certain relationships with the serratus anterior and the trapezius musculature, which will cause an impact due to the deficiency of the hyoid musculature and the external obliques, generating this type of tension impact towards the abdomen. It occurs equally in both chains, but there are small differences. Well, we also talk about derived pathologies. I have already mentioned the relationship that exists, for example, between the eye and scoliosis, but for instance, few people consider the relationship that exists between hernias, between umbilical hernias, abdominal hernias, and myofascial relationships. An impairment of hypotonia in the anterolateral chains of the liver, which is also related to that liver, will make the person prone to this type of hernia. We have also talked about the elbow, but this type of chains, ultimately what we will observe when there is an intestinal impairment is that there are even interactions that affect the vestibular system with the onset of tinnitus, with the onset of vertigo, and with the onset of supraspinatus contracture. Well, we need to be aware that besides working with ginkgo biloba, with vasodilators, or working with B, we can also work in this entire field that will be completely affected or with what we will learn in training or working in a team as well. Many people consider that perhaps we should not operate on bunions, that bunions may be a lived response, even though they can sometimes be of a genetic nature. We have to see that there is, from a transgenerational perspective, an alteration between one chain, let's call it red, along with the other chain called yellow, in such a way that they generate a disturbance in the axis of tension, creating greater tension, an activation of the musculature against the other, which in the long term will produce that bunion over decades. Or to lose marus. Can we reprogram? Yes, we can. We can reprogram. We need to learn what the itineraries of these chains are in order to carry out a series of multimodal works that allow us to work on that reprogramming so that the person can regain normality.